I think anyone who's had a 3D printer for some time will agree that some of the most satisfying prints are just little functional things around the house that make everyday life that much easier. So when I moved into a new, empty house, I decided that I would 3D print anything that I reasonably could. And some questionable things too. Everything else I'll buy at IKEA. I'm in Sweden now, in case you missed that. Time for cool prints. So my stubborn decision to 3D print whatever I could did mean I had to avoid some things that are typically super cheap and simple. Case in point, I could have easily gone to the store and spent a few krona for a perfectly suitable set of coat hangers. But instead, I decided to design, prototype, and 3D print my own from scratch. That did take quite a bit longer than I expected, but I'm actually very glad I did it because I ended up with the coolest coat hangers you've ever seen. These are my EZPZ coat hangers, and they solve a problem I've had with just about every hanger I've used. See, I'm a pretty skinny guy, and that means a lot of my sweaters have little teeny necks. So every time I have to stretch them over a regular old coat hanger, I feel like I'm wearing them out. And you know, these things, they keep me warm and decent out there. They deserve to be treated with respect. This hinged hanger is as gentle as can be. That's all thanks to this hinging design that automatically locks into place, but it's also released just as easily by lifting that up. Folded up like this, the hanger easily slips through the neck of your favorite sweater and opens up with no stretching required. After it locks into place, it's as secure as it needs to be, but it can also be released just by lifting up that little lock. Happy sweater, happy life. What's kind of cool is that the size limitations of my 3D printer are actually part of what inspired this design. I had to split up the arms anyways just to fit them on the print bed, so might as well make it hinged. It also means more options for customization. This is a very simple version printed in carbon fiber PETG that's super lightweight and quicker to print. But then we've also got this really robust version with these broad shoulder attachments that could be used for a heavier coat or something like that. Plus, if you like colors, there's nothing better than multiple parts. In fact, you know what? I feel like ranting. I'm gonna rant. Print in place models are overrated. Multi-part prints that are designed well can actually be very fun to assemble, even satisfying. Oh yeah. Splitting a model into multiple parts also means that you can print each piece in its ideal orientation, so that those parts are often stronger, more simple, and more successful to print. Plus, if one piece fails, then you just reprint that little piece, rather than having the entire project rely on a single print. That's like writing a 10-page essay and never saving along the way. Ridiculous. I get that print in place models are pretty unique to 3D printing, so it's a fun challenge as a designer. And then there's people who have spent years fine-tuning their printers that apparently need challenging models to justify that time spent. But in general, if you're designing something for a mass market, you want that to be as easy to make as possible so that there's more success, less wasted material, and so on. And yes, there are plenty of situations where a print-in-place model is the best option. It's just kind of overused at this point, now that it's a trending idea. So, to you designers out there, don't be afraid to make a multi-part model. Anyways, while these hangers might be a bit overkill, they are fun and extra functional. Plus, I actually look forward to hanging up my clothing now, and how many people can say that? Another household item I needed sooner rather than later were some waste bins. It's hard to ignore trash piling up in cardboard boxes around the house, so I had to come up with something quickly. The main challenge for me here is that waste bins should hold a fairly large volume of junk, and obviously printing large items means using a lot of time and material. And that risks making this whole endeavor totally pointless and stupid. Wouldn't want that. So I decided that I would come up with some structure that allows me to print large, sturdy objects while remaining easy to print using minimal material and of course looking good along the way. my result is this PLEIADES Collection. The beauty of these objects is that they're printed in vase mode, which means the printer can create it as a single continuous spiral of filament rather than multiple layers. And that means less retractions, fewer seams, and generally easier printing. The downside of vase mode is that your prints are limited by the thickness that your printer can extrude a single wall. With a standard 0.4mm nozzle, it is possible to pull off 0.8mm or even 1mm extrusions before things start to get sloppy, but even that isn't very thick for large objects like a trash can. So my trick with these PLEIADES prints is that there are these virtually 0mm cuts that run the length of the objects, and when printed in vase mode, those turn into ribs, and ribs equal strength. Ribs are used all the time in traditional manufacturing precisely because they create stronger parts without adding a lot of material, which is exactly what I was going for here. What I did was basically figure out a way to create those ribs in a very nice and clean way using vase mode on my 3D printer. It also ended up creating a really cool faceted look that I just happen to really like, obviously, based on how many prints I've done. All of this really happened because I decided to start small when testing out my new design, as one generally should. So I started with these little PLEIADES pen holders. These don't actually require the strength of the ribs, but it was just a quick way to prove the concept and see how the prints looked. From there, I went slightly larger with these tea light holders, and besides being small, these also take advantage of the heat dissipation of the PLEIADES form, since it's mostly empty space. There's just a few ribs that make contact with the candle, and it seems to work. Nothing's melted yet with this PETG carbon fiber filament. This cone shape was really working well with the PLEIADES collection, so I made some bigger cones. These are kind of like vases, but not exactly, because they can hold all sorts of things. In my case, I used them to hold my fancy sticks. Lots of great sticks in Sweden. I made this one extra fancy with some strategic leaning to influence the shape as the twig dried, and now it's got this nice swoop. Great stick. I also made some nice soap dispensers when I realized that I didn't actually have to print the whole bottle. These are just lightweight covers that can connect over the top of ugly old bottles and instantly make them more appealing. I printed a black version to match the rest of the collection, but I also made some fun, colorful versions that do a great job of demonstrating how much filament choice can affect the feel of a design. Plus, this green bamboo PLA just perfectly matches the IKEA green that makes up half of my kitchen by now, so I had to do it. Anyways, I did eventually manage to rein in my compulsion to get completely sidetracked, and I made some small trash bins. That was the whole goal. Besides the PLEIADES structure working exactly as intended for the bins, making them pretty strong for having just a 0.8mm thickness, I'm also pretty happy with the lid design. I came up with this inner and outer rim that hold this liner securely in place so that it can fit in there nice and neatly. And then we've just got this hinged lid, which is a print-in-place design. Kind of awkward after that last rant, but it works really well. And it's fun. I made this rectangular version as well as the round variation, and even this little cup holder version to go inside my car. And I know these are still pretty small. I haven't actually gone larger with the PLEIADES bins yet, just because I'm waiting for an even larger printer so that I can make some substantially big bins. But at this point, I am fairly confident in the PLEIADES structure, and I think it'll work really well, even when I scale it up. But for now, I did also come up with a different solution for waste management. In my region of Sweden, we have a system of waste management where we're given these regulated trash bags. Green is for food waste that turns into biogas and fertilizer, and then the red bag is for the rest of the stuff that gets burnt for energy. Whatever doesn't get recycled usually ends up in one of these two bags, so I definitely wanted a convenient way to access them. But the problem still stands that my bamboo X1 carbon isn't quite large enough to create a bin that's as large as these bags. Then I had my realization. What if the bags were the bins? This design works well for so many reasons. For one thing, it's mounted on this door under my kitchen sink, which is basically the most convenient location for it. And because it's all suspended, I don't actually need a bin to contain this bag. Instead, I used my same two-rim design, which securely holds my junk. Wait. And then this wall fixture holds it all in place. I used my same hinged design, which creates this pretty good seal to keep out the smells. And this is really so convenient and accessible. It's definitely one of the favorite things I've printed for the house so far. This design did require some prototyping as well. I printed the mount in polycarbonate and discovered that it's one of those filaments that you do want to keep dry, although in this case, a bit of stringing wasn't such a big deal. Scarier was the fact that my door is quite thin, so I could only use these short 19mm screws to mount my prints. And I also used some tape to make sure I didn't drill too far. After figuring out the ideal placement and making sure everything would be level, I drilled my holes and screwed my brackets into place using 4 of those little screws for each one. That actually went well, but I did notice that the mounts were pretty loose. So to strengthen the grip, I simply changed the design so the arms are pre-bent inwards by just 3 degrees, and that actually made a world of difference. So I finished assembling and was quite happy with how everything worked. Everything remained easy to access, and that clearance is oh so satisfying. However, as the compost bags started filling up over a few days, I began to notice a pretty significant sag, and that definitely made me worried. So I swapped out my mount once more for this significantly beefier version. Maybe slightly overkill, but that made these bins absolutely rock steady, and it sure beats a disastrous spill in the kitchen. Now that I've got this really robust mount, I'm pretty sure that this can handle even a full bag of wet coffee grounds. As long as the bag doesn't break. So, now that I had some ways to store my garbage, I naturally needed to print some ways to collect it. And while 3D printing a broom might seem like my dumbest idea yet, I had to give it a shot. So I hopped back into Autodesk Fusion and whipped up this printable dustpan and brush. Again, I'm starting with a smaller version to test out the idea, and that was especially useful for this design since I'm relying on a lot of bridging to print my brush bristles. Bridging is a cool technique where your printer is extruding an unsupported line of filament, but that relies on your printer having just the right settings to extrude and cool those floating bits at just the right rate. Getting it right can be tricky, especially since I was printing these in ABS. I chose ABS because it's quite durable, but it also prints relatively hot, doesn't like cooling fans, and it shrinks quite a bit as it cools. So I did have several failed attempts, but eventually I got it working. Mostly by printing much slower than the default speeds this X1 carbon likes to flaunt. After printing, I used a utility knife to cut off the support on one side, and that leaves me with all of these individual bristles. I printed my handles separately so the brushes are interchangeable, and I did realize that my first brush was more dense than it needed to be, so this second version has fewer bristles. I also glued some magnets into the handles, and that makes it super easy to neatly stow away the brush and dustpan together, which I quite like. Most importantly, the pair works really well together at collecting dirt and dust. With the success of that smaller version, I went ahead and made my large brush. On this big boy, the bristles are 90mm long, but thanks to my testing on a smaller scale, I did manage to pull it off quite nicely. As I tested it around the house, I was pretty impressed with how well it works. But if I'm gonna release this to everyone on the internet, I have to make sure it's an exceptional print. So I decided to put it to the test the messiest way I know how, with a long overdue bathroom haircut. Yup, I'm still cutting my own hair, and I think I've gotten pretty decent at it by now. But the mess it makes has always been annoying. So that makes it perfect for this test. I just let everything fall straight to the floor, and after trimming from my head down to my toes, I put my dustpan to the test. I know it's a silly thing to be impressed by, but I really wasn't expecting this to work so well. The hair got swept up effortlessly, and since it's all plastic, I can just wash everything off afterwards, and it's good as new. Maybe I'll actually cut my hair more often now. Obviously, when I design something for 3D printing, I want it to be at least as good as the existing options out there. And I was pretty dubious about this brush and the dustpan going into things, but I have been completely blown away by how well this actually works. The dustpan has such a straight edge that it doesn't deal with the problem of dust going underneath the pan, which is something I've dealt with just about every commercial dustpan. And the brush also does a really great job of getting most of the dirt in a single sweep. I'm sure different situations benefit from different lengths and softnesses of brush bristles, but as a general purpose cleaning brush, this thing actually worked really well. Thanks to my modular brush design, I was able to use the same pan and brush to make this standing broom and dustpan. Now, this one isn't entirely printed because it made sense to go with these ridiculously cheap wooden broom handles that I found at Biltema, which is basically the Harbor Freight of Sweden. It was less than $1 for both of these. And while the quality of these threads isn't too great, I did come up with a nice system to fasten my parts into place. Then I just trimmed the sticks to my preferred length, sanded those ends, and I also made this little part that lets me snap them together for storage. My off-center brush design did take a little bit of getting used to, but I actually think it helps me reach into some nooks and crannies, and just like the handheld versions, this broom does a surprisingly good job. So, I've got a full-size broom and dustpan, 3D printed, and it works well. What a world we live in. Well, I've got to say, all of these functional prints are proving to be absolutely invaluable around the house. But the truth is, I'm not just trying to 3D print a house. I want to 3D print a home. And to pull that off, well, some decoration doesn't hurt either. So, I have already shared some decoration in the form of my PLEIADES cones, but I have started collecting some living plants as well, and that means I've been developing all sorts of different styles for my pots and planters. One that I really love is this big Vesuvius pot I made for my Spathiphyllum plant here. And this Vesuvius collection was actually inspired by the same principles as my PLEIADES collection, using ribs to strengthen a vase mode print. In this case, the ribs are just on the outside, and I made them all zigzaggy for some extra pizzazz. We've also got many more ribs because this is just a big plant and I wanted to make sure I can contain all of the soil that's in here. This pot was printed using Bamboo Labs Solar Breeze Gradient PLA, so it actually fades between these subtle hues of orangish pink, and it paired really well with the zigzag design of this Vesuvius pot. The print is so clean, the filament works really well with this design. I'm just so happy with it overall. And I also designed these floating drip trays, which have a little hidden platform underneath so that the whole pot looks like it's hovering slightly. So despite how big and heavy this pot is, that brings some brevity, some lightness to the whole design. And I've been using those for pretty much all of my plants. Those are actually functional as well because they catch the excess water that runs through the pot. Pretty cool. I love this design so much that I used the full build volume of my printer once more for this bin version, which could also be used as a planter, a trash can, a drum, or however you see fit. I also made this tiny version for my Hoya heart plant. How weird is it to accessorize my plants with dead insects? Well, I don't care. Perhaps equally as wild is this pleats pot I made for my lovely little Monstera deliciosa here. Again, I paired it with my hovering drip trays, and as you can see, I've started introducing a bit more color into my home. That said, as I showed with the PLEIADES soap dispensers before, color can really affect the feel of a design. So here's another pleats planter I made, but I printed this using Polyterra matte white PLA, and it just comes off as a much more elegant piece, in my opinion. It's also a closer reflection of the origami folds that inspired this design, so I actually really like this as well. Also, one cool thing I wanted to share about vase mode prints like this is that you can scale them however you want, and because they're printed in vase mode, the wall thickness isn't affected. This big planter was actually printed using the same exact file as this blue one here, but I used some non-uniform scaling in the slicer to make it a rather different form. It's still printed beautifully, and I think it's pretty cool. So I really want to encourage y'all to get a little creative in the slicer and maybe try transforming the pieces a bit to make them your own. Before settling on this wild pleats pot for my Monstera, I did try a few different styles. So here we've got a slightly more subtle spiralis pot, and I also really love this meridian pot I made, which uses a very simple filament swap halfway through the print to really level up the design just that much more. And again, don't be afraid to get a little creative. Here's a little tiny version I printed, and that's a really nice key holder. So these don't have to be just for plants. Along with all of these new styles I've been introducing, I also figured it's about time I revisit my most downloaded 3D print ever, which is this chromatic vase. 7 years after the original, I decided to redesign this from scratch to be ever so slightly refined, so it's easier to 3D print than ever, and I also added a slight taper to the neck, which I just happen to really like. I've also started adding some more shapes to the collection because, after all, 3D printing is all about choices. These were printed using Bambu Lab's Marble PLA, which does a great job of showing off the form through all those sharp highlights and shadows. On the other hand, I used this dual silk PLA, which ended up coming out a bit sloppy, but I actually really like the patterns that are created from those defects in printing. I'm tempted to explore that a bit further and see how I can use that a bit more intentionally. Now, with so many new collections started, I'm really going to be relying on your feedback in the comments and the number of downloads to determine which of these collections I continue to push forward. So, after this video, make sure you visit Things and download your favorites ASAP. That said, if you do love them all, you can enjoy the full assortment in the form of my second set of cool Can Coozies. I went ahead and made 6 different sleeves for your favorite canned beverages, inspired by all of these new designs. Again, these are also printed in vase mode, so you're free to scale them up, slice them, chop them however you like, and make them work for your needs. These could become some cool planters as well, some pen holders. I don't know, get creative. Finally, with this new addiction to plants that I'm quickly developing, I wanted a fancy way to keep them hydrated. So I came up with this eccentric ITALIC Watering Can. This was printed using Bambu Lab ABS, and thanks to the super clean printing of the X1 Carbon, it was watertight right off the print bed with default settings. And as with any good super fancy designer product, it's ever so slightly awkward to use. Like, do you hold it like this, or like this, like this? It's kind of weird, but honestly, it works really well. You fill it up through this opening in the handle, and by placing your thumb over that opening, you can actually control the pour really well. And speaking of the pour, it is absolutely beautiful. Look at that laminar flow. All right, believe it or not, There are even more things I've printed around the house, but I think I've shown you plenty for today. I mean, it's already time for another haircut, so I'm calling it for this episode of Cool Prints. That said, please let me know in the comments if you have suggestions for other things I should print around the house. And as always, I'll put links in the description so you can download and print these files for yourself. They'll be on Thangs, many of them for free, and some exclusive for Thangs subscribers. Your subscriptions have been helping out so much during this period of moving between countries. Tack så jättemycket. And thanks to all of you for watching this video. As always, there are so many ideas I can't wait to share with you, so I hope you'll stick around for the next video. But until then, take care, and as always, stay inspired.